with a 1/2 inch seam allowance down the center front. After you stitch your seam, give it a press open, then take your back piece and put it wrong sides together on top of the bodice. Next, we'll stitch along the side seams and the shoulder seams with a small seam allowance, about 1/4 of an inch or less, and then we'll make a French seam. Once you've sewn with a small seam allowance, give it a press, and then we're going to flip it inside out. So we're sewing it right sides together, and we're going to finish our French seams. So a French seam is a seam that is, the seam allowance ends up being encased inside the fabric, inside the seam. So I press it after my first seam, it's sewn with a tiny seam allowance. And I flip it over, press it, and then what we need to do is stitch along here with about a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then that encases your seam. It catches the raw edge on the inside, and you have a really nice finished seam. So do that around all 4 sides. Once your binding is sewn on, you need to give it a press all the way around, press it open. And what we're going to do is we're going to move this binding up. Give it a press so it covers the seam allowance. Fold it up, and this is where we are going to stitch it. Take your center piece and pin it on. I just put 2 pins in the center just to anchor it. Then we need to just fold under a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of the edge here. Pin that in place. Once your edges are pinned and tucked under, carefully stitch along the edge. To make the drawstring, put the 2 pieces right sides together and just do a little stitch there to make one long strip. Then we are going to fold it in half lengthwise, pin it, and stitch it along this edge. Now to make the tube, we will need a tool like this, a tube turner, and you just stick it in. You grab the end here and you pull it through so it flips it right side out. Once your drawstring is made, insert the loop turner through the channel in the front of the top, and then hook the drawstring onto the end and pull it through one channel. You're going to slide that down to this point here, to the V-neck point, and then we will put this back inside. I also put a knot in the end of my drawstring. I'm going to clip the frayed edge. You could also put a bead in here, or if you wanted to as well, instead of the drawstring, you could use a ribbon. And then we'll just give this a quick stitch to hold it in place before we move on to the next step. Pin the bias binding right sides together around the neckline edge, and then just stitch around this crease in your bias binding. Now it's time to sew our sleeve. So we're going to create another French seam here. So take your sleeve and fold it so it is wrong sides touching, and stitch with a small seam allowance about 1/4 inch on this edge. Once you stitch down the side, you've now got a nice French seam. Give it a press, flip it right side out, and then you're ready for the cuff. To sew the cuff, fold it so it is right sides together, and stitch down here. After you stitch your seam, press it open, and then we're going to match it up with the sleeve, right sides to right sides. I always like to match the seams together first, like right here. Stitch along the edge here. Once you've stitched along the cuff here, then we need to fold the cuff to the halfway point. Once you found the halfway point, we're going to press along this edge, then flip it over and fold the seam allowance back so this matches. Pin it down and then top stitch along the edge. Once your sleeve is all sewn, we're ready to put it into the armhole of the bodice. So put them right sides together. I like to match my underarm seams first. Then I take the top notch here and match it with the shoulder seam, and then match the other notches. And then in this area here where there's more sleeve than armhole, you just have to do your best to ease it in. The reason why there is more sleeve than armhole is so that you can actually move your arms, otherwise it'd be really hard to move your arms in it. So do your best to kind of even out how to pin it in here. And then stitch it at a 1/2 inch seam allowance.